spotlight on Singapore. President Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong Un hold their historic summit with the world watching. We have reaction from the White House and Capitol Hill. A new hurdle. The Trump administration makes it more difficult for asylum seekers coming to the U.S. We have the latest. Christian concerns. Why a recent incident in India has the faithful worried about their safety. And gridlock in Washington. The nation's capital comes to a stop to celebrate its hockey team. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, June 12, 2018.
We both want to do something. We both are going to do something. And we have developed a very special bond.
President Donald Trump is thanking North Korean leader Kim Jong Un for taking the bold first step towards a bright new future for his people after the leader's historic Singapore summit. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Lauren Ashburn is on assignment. President Trump is optimistic, but U.S. lawmakers are urging caution. In a landmark agreement, Kim Jong Un agrees to work towards complete denuclearization. In exchange, President Trump says he'll provide North Korea with security guarantees. White House correspondent Mark Irons has more. Mark?
Wyatt, this is the first time a sitting U.S. president has ever met with the leader of North Korea. The focus was denuclearization, but President Trump says they also discussed human rights and the plight of Christians in North Korea. The negotiations started with a historic handshake. After a warm embrace and historic meetings,
It's an honor to be with you.
President Trump and Kim Jong Un commit to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean peninsula. The president trusting the dictator to uphold his end of the deal.
He reaffirmed his unwavering commitment to complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula.
If Kim follows through, dismantling his nuclear program could take years. For starters, President Trump says North Korea agreed to destroy a missile engine testing site.
Today is the beginning of an arduous process. Our eyes are wide open, but peace is always worth the effort.
For his part, the president plans to end joint U.S.-South Korea military exercises. He calls them expensive, and North Korea views them as threatening.
I think it's inappropriate to be having war games.
Without giving much detail, President Trump says he also discussed the issue of human rights abuses in North Korea.
I believe it's a rough situation over there. There's no question about it.
The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has documented the abuse. It says the North Korean regime is known to arrest, torture, imprison, and even execute religious believers, including Christians.
Christians, yes, we are brought it up very strongly.
President Trump also says Otto Warmbier, the American who was imprisoned in North Korea, did not die in vain.
I think without Otto, this would not have happened. Something happened from that day. It was a terrible thing. It was brutal. But a lot of people started to focus on what was going on, including North Korea.
Its leader Kim Jong Un said the world will see a major change. President Trump noted the U.S. would have to verify North Korean denuclearization to make sure it is total and complete. More meetings between the two countries are planned to take place. Wyatt?
Mark, Pope Francis has been praying for peace on the Korean peninsula. How are church officials reacting to the summit?
The Catholic Bishops' Conference in South Korea says the commitments made at the summit were a surprise and a joy. Now those same bishops are calling for a novena starting June 17th to pray for reconciliation with North Korea. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Joining me now is Dr. Balbina Wong, visiting professor at Georgetown University and former senior special advisor at the State Department. Dr. Wong, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
This signed document by President Trump and Chairman Kim says North Korea is committed towards working toward denuclearization. Do you think this summit was a success, in your view?
Well, I think that it's actually a mistake to define the summit as, either a success or a failure. From the beginning, we should never have been thinking about this in terms of a zero-sum type of a summit. I think actually President Trump made a very valid point by saying that it was really about meeting Kim Jong Un and trying to set up a personal relationship. In fact, that is really what the purpose of the summit was about. And it was actually important because North Korea has been one of the most intractable problems in international relations, and this has been a very, very difficult regime to deal with, and it has been a very mysterious regime for most of the world. And so it was actually very important to meet this leader face to face and try to set up a relationship and establish a relationship. And I think President Trump actually did manage to begin that process. Now, in terms of the denuclearization, no, I don't think the summit actually went very far at all. And all it really did was to summarize and reiterate what has already been agreed to in previous statements and agreements.
You talk about the problems with the regime. One of the problems is human rights abuses. And of course, human rights advocates are hoping President Trump would bring up more of the problem with the tens of thousands of North Korean citizens in labor camps, some of them Christians as well. During his State of the Union, President Trump even brought this up. Do you think that human rights abuses should have been more of a priority during this summit?
Well, yes, absolutely. And in fact, it's very important to point out that until very recently, in fact, the one area in which President Trump has actually been amazingly and surprisingly consistent for a president who has been arguably incredibly unpredictable and absolutely inconsistent, especially on human rights. And I think it's been correct to have been critical about him in terms of his stance on human rights around the world, except on North Korea. He has been remarkably, surprisingly, very, very strongly in support of calling out North Korea about human rights at every single public forum. He did this not only at the State of the Union address, but in every single speech. Every single time it came to talking about the Korean Peninsula. He's done this when he went to South Korea. It was actually quite remarkable, and I gave him so much credit for it. And it was so important because North Korea is absolutely one of the worst human rights abusers in the entire world, and it has been for 70 years. And absolutely, its treatment against Christians and against religious freedom is one of the worst. And by the way, it's hundreds of thousands. We can not call it anything less than concentration camps.
Critics say President Trump's decision to stop or halt the joint U.S.-South Korean military drills and to talk about potentially removing U.S. troops slowly from South Korea as a mistake, or at least giving some more leverage to North Korea. Do you think that's true? Do you think we're giving too many concessions to them? And what do you think that means for South Korea?
Well, yes and no. I think it was actually not surprising at all, given that this is absolutely what this president, meaning Donald J. Trump, this is, I believe, what he himself has personally believed for a very long time, even before he assumed office. And he has clearly said and believed this throughout his campaign for the presidency, and believe this as he has sat in the Oval Office. And this goes against what all of the security establishment has felt and what many of his advisors have advised him. This is not a partisan idea. This is essentially what the U.S. national security environment has essentially supported since 1950, which is to support the U.S. alliance for South Korea. Now, interestingly, I think for the very first time since the Korean War, you actually have a time when you have a North Korean leader and a South Korean leader and a U.S. president that actually supports the removal of U.S. forces from the Korean Peninsula.
And are willing to all talk to each other about it.
That's exactly right. And so I think that now we are seeing the beginning of this process. So we'll simply have to see.
Right. Like I said, if anything, it's a first step. So many issues that we'll continue to cover. Dr. Balbina Wong, visiting professor at Georgetown University, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Some Democrats are critical of the agreement that came out of the summit, but the Senate Majority Leader calls it a major first step towards peace. Correspondent Jason Calvi reports from Capitol Hill. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. The Kentucky Republican also says if the North does not follow through with complete denuclearization, the U.S. and its allies should be prepared to apply maximum pressure. His colleagues in both parties are concerned North Korea won't keep their promises.
After the historic summit in Singapore, attention shifts to Capitol Hill, where lawmakers weigh in.
I appreciate the fact that the president was willing to sit down, and we'll see what happens.
But they've agreed to these things in the past, Senator.
Yeah, is the third time a charm? I don't know.
Some Democrats blame President Trump for giving the dictator international legitimacy.
I think Kim Jong Un got two huge wins. One, he got the most powerful nation, which is still us, to recognize his regime, murderous as it is.
Democrats say the president has given away too much by just sharing the stage with North Korea. What do you say to that?
So I think everybody ought to give the president a little bit of flexibility to try to continue to work this out. This is in the best interest of not only the region but the world, and this shouldn't become a partisan issue.
Senator John Kennedy, a Republican from Louisiana, tells me the United States must be skeptical of North Korea's leader.
Kim Jong Un is a butcher. He's a butcher of his own people. He killed his own uncle with a missile. He poisoned his brother. And he's been a butcher of his own people. Dealing with him is like trying to hand feed a shark. It can be done, but you have to do it very carefully.
President Trump called Republican senators from Air Force One on his way home from the summit, and he sounded upbeat. Now, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he hopes any agreement that emerges from the meeting takes the form of a treaty, and that treaty would come before the Senate for a vote. Wyatt?
Correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow is recovering after suffering a mild heart attack. The president revealed the news in a tweet on his way to the summit with Kim Jong Un. The 70-year-old Catholic convert accompanied President Trump on his trip to the G7 meetings in Quebec last week. He joined the administration earlier this year following a long career in television news. Most victims of domestic and gang violence will no longer get asylum protection from the United States. The official announcement came from the Attorney General Jeff Sessions Monday. Some asylum seekers hoping for help from the U.S. will face a new hurdle.
We understand that all are due proper respect in court and the proper legal process. But we cannot abandon legal discipline and sound legal concepts.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who oversees immigration courts, says the White House is overturning protections for those seeking asylum from gang and domestic violence.
We have not acted hastily, but carefully. In my judgment, this will be a correct interpretation of the law.
After this change from the Department of Justice, victims of violence can only qualify for asylum if they can prove their native country will not protect them from additional danger.
Asylum was never meant to alleviate all problems, even all serious problems that people face every day all over the world.
Critics of this move include the American Immigration Lawyers Association. In a statement, the nonpartisan nonprofit organization said, "The Attorney General is inappropriately prejudging these cases and disregarding the principle that every single asylum case must be carefully considered on its own merits." The AILA also says it expects this case will be decided in court. According to the Department of Homeland Security, more than 60,000 people from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador applied for some form of asylum in 2016 alone. Lauren Ashburn is south of the border this week reporting on the Catholic Church in Mexico. She joins us now with a preview of what you'll see this week on EWTN News Nightly. Lauren?
Wyatt, we're in Mexico City continuing our in-depth coverage on immigration. Last week, we were in Texas exploring the U.S.-Mexican border. This week, we're on the other side of the border talking to Archbishop Carlos Aguilar Retes, who leads more than 7 million Catholics at one of the largest archdioceses in the world. We will take an inside look at 2 migrant shelters receiving support from the Catholic Church and organizations. We will introduce you to Yulek Plowey, one of the first World War II refugees helped by Catholic Relief Services. We will travel with him back to where he first settled in Mexico. Our reports will be all week. Wyatt?
Our thanks to Lauren Ashburn reporting from Mexico City. As she said, you can see her reports all week right here on EWTN News Nightly. Italy sends 2 ships to help deliver more than 600 migrants to Spain. The refugees have been stuck in international waters since Saturday. They were refused entry into both Italy and Malta. Spain says it will accept the group in its port of Valencia, roughly 900 miles away. On board are 123 unaccompanied minors and 6 pregnant women. Israeli security forces began evicting Jewish settlers from 15 homes built illegally in the West Bank. The country's Supreme Court ordered the moves, saying the houses are on private land in the Palestinian territory. Israel's government says it will compensate the residents. 2 gunmen kill a Catholic priest as he prepares to celebrate Mass in the Philippines. Father Richmond Nilo was murdered on the altar at his church in Zaragoza. He is the 3rd priest in 6 months to be killed in the predominantly Catholic nation. Many priests and missionaries have fallen victim to violence by Muslim extremists and criminal syndicates. Coming up, why a recent protest is worrying Christians in India. And we dive into the controversial aspects of the upcoming World Meeting of Families in Ireland. Today is the birthday of 41st President George H.W. Bush. He is the first former commander-in-chief to reach the age of 94. Mr. Bush is celebrating at his home in Maine. He was released 8 days ago from the hospital where he was treated for low blood pressure. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. A video circulating on the internet is raising concern for India's Christian minority. In it, a small group of Hindu nationalists are seen stomping on images of Pope Francis as they call for Christians to get out of their country. The video surfaced a few weeks after the Archbishop of Delhi wrote a letter calling for a 1-year prayer campaign leading up to India's 2019 general elections. Joining me now is Farah Isfahani, Global Fellow at the Wilson Center. Farah, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Several members of India's ruling party, the BJP party, have condemned this letter by the Archbishop. They called it a divisive move, which I think is the first time I've ever heard a prayer campaign being called a divisive move. What is life like for Christians in India right now, especially under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is part of the same party that some have accused of being sympathetic to Hindu nationalists?
There is definitely a change in India. There is a great deal of change. Religious minorities in India, particularly if you look at it, Christians and Muslims. Christianity dates back 2,000 years in India. And so when you have Hindu nationalists calling Christians foreigners, telling them to go home, or to do ghar wapsi, which means literally return home, which means return home to Hinduism, that if you're not a Hindu, you're not an Indian. And so we have not got any clarification from Prime Minister Modi and the ruling party saying to the lower ranks of the BJP and other extremist Hindu groups which have been allied to them that no, they are as Indian as you and I are. The Indian Constitution says whether you're Hindu or Christian or Jain or Buddhist or Muslim, you are equally Indian.
Right.
But this is today in India. Number one on the agenda is to stop missionary activity by Christians.
It's interesting because you mentioned the Christian minority, which is about 2% of India's population. Muslims are nearly 14%. So I want to switch gears to that minority as well, because Modi's running for re-election in 2019. He's also been accused of anti-Muslim bias in the past. As you mentioned, his party doesn't necessarily have a great track record of that. What do you think would be the implications if Modi won a second term for religious minorities?
I think it would be terrible. Leading Christian figures, Catholic figures in India have called on the Christian community, and within the Muslim community, they have called to their flock, saying, you must get out there, you must vote in the next election, because a second term could be very, very harmful. Because at the moment, the Constitution and the laws at least give people an equal status regardless of their faith. But if there is a second term and there's tampering with the Constitution and laws are changed, well, then you have Pakistan, and you know where that leads you.
Yeah, and Pakistan's had so many problems, of course, with treatment of religious minorities. So I know that minorities there in the region will be praying for an election that is favorable towards all people. Farah Ispahani, Global Fellow at the Wilson Center, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you so much.
Tomorrow is the feast day of St. Anthony of Padua. He is honored in a big way in Portugal, where he was born. The celebration lasts 3 days. Festivities include eating sardines. The fish is associated with the saint's work with the poor. There's also visits to a museum that features artifacts from his life. St. Anthony was a Franciscan monk and the first doctor of the Catholic Church. He died in 1231. Up next, the schedule of events for this summer's World Meeting of Families in Ireland is now public. And hockey fans in Washington celebrate a capital achievement. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. The World Meeting of Families in Ireland this August will feature workshops on hot-button issues facing Catholic families, including protecting children from clergy sexual abuse, weathering divorce, and ministering to Catholics who are lesbian and gay. Organizers have unveiled the program, and it includes some surprising entries. Perhaps none is more surprising than the inclusion of Father James Martin, an American Jesuit, scheduled to deliver a presentation on welcoming Catholics who are gay into the church. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome with more on the upcoming World Meeting of Families. Juliet, can you tell us more about Father Martin and what he will be speaking about?
Wyatt, according to the official schedule, Father James Martin's talk is entitled, quote, Showing Welcome and Respect in Our Parishes for LGBTQ People and Their Families. Now, Martin is the author of Building a Bridge. It's a book about Catholic outreach to the gay community, and he calls for the Church to better accompany Catholics who identify as gay. Now, the Church has always reached out to different groups in the fold, including gays and lesbians. That's not new. There's nothing new or controversial there. What is controversial, Wyatt, about Father Martin is that he seems to blur the Church's teaching on homosexuality and his support for gays and lesbians. Now, that teaching says that homosexual activity is disordered and sinful. But the Catechism also says the gay community must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, and not be discriminated against.
And of course, Father Martin's speech is just one of many talks during the 5-day event. Can you give us some of the other highlights?
Of course. So the meeting will focus on key issues taken from the Holy Father's document, The Joy of Love. And those topics include the impact of technology on the family, how to find time to pray in the digital age, women in leadership, and helping raise families out of poverty. So there's a broad spectrum of topics being covered, while speakers like Bishop Robert Barron of Los Angeles will talk, Father Leo Patalingha, who hosts a cooking show on EWTN, as well as cardinals and lay Catholics from around the world. Now, the goal is to help Catholic families live out their faith and deal with all the problems and suffering that life can present.
Juliet, I understand the Holy Father will also take part.
That's absolutely right, Wyatt. Pope Francis will join the meeting for the last 2 days, and he'll also preside over the final Mass in Dublin. Now, that's expected to draw hundreds of thousands. As you will remember, the Pope took part in the last World Meeting of Families that was in Philadelphia in 2015 during his trip to the United States, and he delighted the crowds with an off-the-cuff talk on family life. You might remember the Holy Father highlighted the divine nature of the family, but he also talked about the difficulties. He joked, saying that he knows that sometimes plates can fly in a household, but he added that we overcome those difficulties with the light of the resurrection and with hope and with love.
And of course, so many want to hear what the Pope has to say in the upcoming World Meeting of Families as well, so we'll be watching. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
And finally tonight, things came to a standstill in the nation's capital. For a good reason. Hockey fans are celebrating the Washington Capitals winning the Stanley Cup. Captain Alex Ovechkin holds the trophy. The franchise won it for the first time in its 44-year history by beating the Vegas Golden Knights 4-1. Hundreds of thousands of fans flocked to the National Mall to celebrate with the team. And congratulations to the Capitals for a great season. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. Don't forget, Lauren Ashburn will have a report from Mexico tomorrow, so be sure to watch. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Good night, and God bless.